The bikers saw a frail, 78-year-old man alone at the end of the bar. Easy target, defenseless victim. What they didn't see was the Purple Heart citation in his wallet, or the phone number in my contacts labeled Uncle Sam's Finest. 20 minutes later, they understood the difference between a victim and a veteran's family. The Rusty Anchor wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find trouble on a Tuesday night. Located on the outskirts of Bakersfield, it was a working-class dive bar that catered to truckers, oil field workers, and the occasional group of bikers passing through on Highway 58. The neon beer signs cast a dim glow over worn wooden tables, and the jukebox in the corner played classic rock at a volume that made conversation possible but not easy. My grandfather, Frank Morrison, had been coming to the Rusty Anchor every Tuesday for the past 3 years. At 78, he was a creature of habit. Same bar stool, same order of Budweiser and a whiskey chaser, same quiet demeanor that kept him largely invisible to the other patrons. The bartender, Maria, knew him by name and always had his drinks ready by the time he settled onto his usual stool at the far end of the bar. But tonight was different. Tonight, the devil's advocates had rolled into town. The 5 bikers who pushed through the bar's heavy wooden door at 9:30 p.m. were everything you'd expect from a stereotypical motorcycle gang. Leather vests covered in patches, chains hanging from their belts, and the kind of swagger that came from years of intimidating people who couldn't fight back. Their leader, a massive man with a gray beard and arms covered in prison tattoos, surveyed the bar like a predator sizing up prey. "This place'll do," he announced to his companions, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Bobby, get us a table. Snake, watch the door. Rest of you, let's see what kind of fun we can have in this shithole." The other patrons immediately went quiet, their conversations dying as the bikers spread out through the small space. Maria, the bartender, tensed behind the bar, her hand instinctively moving toward the aluminum bat she kept hidden beneath the register. She'd seen this type before, men who fed on fear and viewed any reaction as either submission or challenge. Grandpa Frank didn't react at all. He continued nursing his beer, his pale blue eyes focused on the amber liquid, as if the approaching storm was invisible to him. To anyone watching, he looked exactly like what he was, a tired old man who just wanted to drink in peace. That should have been the end of it. But fate had other plans. The biker leader, who went by Diesel according to the patch on his vest, noticed my grandfather almost immediately. Maybe it was the way Frank sat perfectly still while everyone else fidgeted nervously. Maybe it was the fact that he was the oldest person in the bar, and therefore the most vulnerable target. Or maybe Diesel was just looking for an excuse to establish dominance in his new territory. "Hey, old man," Diesel called out, his boots echoing on the wooden floor as he approached Frank's end of the bar. "You deaf or just rude? I'm talking to you." Frank looked up slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Evening," he said quietly, then returned his attention to his drink. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. In Diesel's world, that kind of disrespect couldn't be tolerated, especially not from someone who looked like he could be blown over by a strong wind. "Evening?" Diesel repeated, his voice rising. "That's all you got to say? You don't welcome us to your little town? You don't offer to buy us around?" Frank's grip on his beer bottle tightened slightly, the only sign that he was aware of the escalating danger. "I don't talk much," he said, still not looking at the biker. That's when Diesel made his first mistake. He interpreted Frank's quietness as fear. "You don't talk much?" Diesel mocked, turning to his companions with a theatrical laugh. "Hear that, boys? The old fart doesn't talk much. Maybe we can help him find his voice. Snake, a wiry man with methamphetamine teeth and swastika tattoos on his neck, grinned at his leader's joke. Want me to get his attention, Diesel? Nah, let me handle this. Diesel turned back to Frank, leaning close enough that my grandfather could smell the mixture of cheap whiskey and motor oil on his breath. See, old man, this is how things work. When the devil's advocates come to town, everyone shows respect. Everyone pays tribute. And everyone understands that we own whatever bar we choose to drink in. Frank finally looked up, meeting Diesel's eyes with a steady gaze that held no fear, no anger, just a kind of patient weariness. I paid for my drinks, he said simply. I'm not causing trouble. Not causing trouble? Diesel's voice cracked like a whip. You're disrespecting me in front of my boys. That is trouble. The other patrons were edging toward the exits now, sensing that violence was inevitable. Maria reached for her phone, probably debating whether calling the sheriff was worth the risk of making things worse. The nearest deputy was at least 15 minutes away, and a lot could happen in 15 minutes. Frank must have sensed it too, because he reached into his wallet and threw a $20 bill on the bar. Keep the change, Maria, he said, standing up slowly from his stool. I'll see you next week. But Diesel wasn't finished. He grabbed Frank's shoulder and spun him around. You don't leave when I'm talking to you, old man. You leave when I tell you to leave. That's when I received the phone call that changed everything. I was at home, about 30 miles away, grading papers for my high school history class, when my phone buzzed with an unknown local number. When I answered, Maria's voice was tight with fear. Danny, this is Maria from the Rusty Anchor. You need to get down here. There's bikers hassling your grandfather, and I think things are about to get bad. My blood went cold. Grandpa Frank was the toughest man I knew, but he was also 78 years old and alone against what sounded like multiple attackers. I threw on clothes and headed for my truck, but even driving fast, I was still 25 minutes away. That's when I made the call that would change 5 bikers' lives forever. Most people would have called 911. I had a different number in my phone, a contact I'd inherited along with my grandfather's trust and his war stories. The number was listed under Uncle Sam's Finest, and it connected directly to Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez at the Naval Special Warfare Command in San Diego. Rodriguez, a crisp voice answered on the second ring. Chief, this is Danny Morrison, Frank Morrison's grandson. Grandpa's in trouble. Bikers are threatening him at a bar in Bakersfield. I'm 20 minutes out, but... Say no more. Rodriguez cut me off. What's the location? I gave him the address of the Rusty Anchor, and I could hear him typing rapidly on a keyboard. Danny, I need you to listen carefully. There's a SEAL training exercise happening at China Lake right now. That's 15 minutes flight time from your location. Stay on the line and keep me updated. And Danny, your grandfather is not going to be alone tonight. Meanwhile, back at the Rusty Anchor, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Diesel had Frank pressed against the bar, one meaty hand gripping the old man's shirt, while the other was balled into a fist. The biker leader's face was flushed red with alcohol and rage, and flecks of spittle flew from his mouth as he shouted, You think you're better than us, don't you, old man? Sitting there all quiet and superior, like we're dirt under your shoes. Well, let me tell you something. In about 10 seconds, you're going to be the dirt. Frank's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the now silent bar. Son, I've been threatened by better men than you, and they're all dead now. The words hit Diesel like a physical blow, mainly because of how they were delivered, not with bravado or false courage, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a simple truth. "What did you just say to me?" Diesel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I said you remind me of a North Vietnamese colonel I met in 1968. He thought intimidation was a substitute for strength, too." Frank's pale blue eyes never wavered from Diesel's face. He was wrong. Snake laughed nervously. "Listen to this old fuck, Diesel. Thinks he's Rambo or something." But Diesel wasn't laughing. There was something in Frank's voice, something in the way he stood perfectly still despite being pressed against the bar, that triggered a primal warning in the biker's brain. For just a moment, Diesel hesitated. That moment of hesitation probably saved his life, because what Diesel couldn't know, what none of the bikers could know, was that my grandfather wasn't just some random old man. Frank Morrison was a Purple Heart recipient who had earned his medal during the Tet Offensive, when his Marine platoon had held off 3 companies of NVA regulars for 18 hours while waiting for extraction. The quiet man they were threatening had killed more enemy soldiers with his bare hands than they had years of freedom between them. But Diesel's hesitation lasted only seconds before his pride overrode his instincts. "You know what, old man? I was going to make this quick. Now I'm going to make it hurt." The first punch caught Frank in the stomach, doubling him over. The second was an uppercut that snapped his head back and opened a cut above his left eyebrow. But it was the third punch, a vicious right hook that sent Frank crashing to the floor, that sealed the biker's fate. Because at that exact moment, Chief Rodriguez's voice crackled through my phone. "Danny, tell me your grandfather is still conscious." "Oh, no, I don't know," I said, pressing the accelerator harder as I raced through the darkness toward the rusty anchor. "Maria called 5 minutes ago. They were threatening him then." "Copy that. Phantom team is wheels up. ETA 12 minutes to your location." While Rodriguez was coordinating the response from San Diego, the beating was escalating inside the bar. Frank was on the ground now, trying to protect his head with his arms while Diesel and 2 other bikers took turns kicking him in the ribs and back. "Please stop," Maria begged from behind the bar. "He's just an old man." "You're going to kill him." "That's the idea, sweetheart," Snake snarled. "Maybe next time the locals will show proper respect." But Frank Morrison had survived the jungles of Vietnam, and he wasn't going to die on the floor of a roadside bar. As Diesel drew back his boot for another kick, Frank grabbed the biker's ankle and twisted with a strength that shocked everyone in the room. Diesel crashed to the floor, his head striking a table on the way down. Before the other bikers could react, Frank was on his feet, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for a man his age. The combat training never really leaves you. Even at 78, even bleeding from multiple wounds, Frank Morrison's muscle memory kicked in with lethal efficiency. He grabbed a beer bottle from a nearby table and broke it against Snake's temple in one fluid motion. Snake dropped instantly. The remaining 3 bikers rushed him at once, but Frank had fought better men in worse conditions. He used their momentum against them, grabbing the first attacker and throwing him into the second. The third biker managed to land a solid punch to Frank's jaw, but the old Marine barely flinched. That's when the sound of helicopters filled the night air. Everyone in the bar froze at the distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of military rotors approaching fast and low. Through the bar's windows, they could see searchlights sweeping the parking lot, and the thunder of the aircraft was so loud it rattled the building's windows. "What the fuck is that?" One of the bikers gasped, his earlier bravado completely gone. Frank straightened his shirt and wiped blood from his lip. That, he said calmly, would be my family. The helicopters, two MH-60 Blackhawks carrying a full SEAL team, settled into the parking lot with military precision. The downdraft from their rotors sent dust and debris swirling through the air, and the sound was deafening even inside the bar. Diesel, who was just getting back to his feet, stared through the window in disbelief. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This can't be real." But it was very real, and it was about to get worse for the devil's advocates. The bar's front door exploded inward, as if it had been hit by a battering ram. Through the smoke and debris came 8 men in full combat gear, night vision goggles, automatic weapons, and body armor that made them look like science fiction warriors. They moved with the fluid coordination of a unit that had trained together for years, establishing fields of fire and controlling the room in seconds. "Everyone on the ground, now!" The voice that boomed through the bar belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Stevens, the SEAL team leader. He was a compact, muscular man whose presence filled the room despite his relatively small stature. The other SEALs spread out behind him, their weapons trained on the bikers who stood frozen in shock. "Frank Morrison?" Stevens called out, his voice slightly softer now. "Present and accounted for," Frank replied, snapping to attention despite his injuries. Stevens lowered his weapon and approached my grandfather, his trained eyes quickly assessing the damage. "Jesus, Frank. They worked you over pretty good." "I've had worse," Frank replied, "but I appreciate the backup." The bikers were beginning to understand that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Diesel, who moments before had been kicking an old man on the floor, now found himself staring down the barrel of an assault rifle held by a Navy SEAL. The transformation from predator to prey had taken exactly 30 seconds. "Please," Diesel stammered. "We didn't know. We didn't know he was military." Stevens looked at him with the kind of cold contempt usually reserved for enemy combatants. "You didn't know he was military? You beat up a 78-year-old man because you thought he was a civilian." We were just having some fun. We didn't mean to hurt him bad." "Fun?" Stevens repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You call beating an elderly man unconscious fun?" That's when I finally arrived at the Rusty Anchor, screeching into the parking lot just as the situation was being brought under control. The sight that greeted me, 2 military helicopters, 8 Navy SEALs, and 5 bikers lying face down on the floor with zip-tie restraints, was surreal enough to make me question my own sanity. But the most surreal part was my grandfather, standing calmly in the middle of it all with blood on his shirt and a slight smile on his face. "Hey, Danny," he said as I rushed through the door. "Thanks for calling the cavalry." Stevens looked back and forth between us, then shook his head with something that might have been amusement. "You're the grandson? The one who called Chief Rodriguez?" "Yes, sir." "Is my grandfather okay?" "He's tougher than he looks," Stevens replied, "but these 5 assholes are going to wish they'd stayed home tonight." The aftermath was swift and decisive. The devil's advocates found themselves facing federal charges that would keep them in prison for decades. Assaulting a Purple Heart recipient was a federal crime, and doing it in front of witnesses while making threats about taking over the town added conspiracy and domestic terrorism charges to the list. But more importantly, word spread through the criminal community with the speed of wildfire. Frank Morrison was untouchable. The old man who drank quietly at the end of the bar every Tuesday had friends in very high places, friends who would respond with overwhelming force to protect him. A week later, I sat with my grandfather at the same bar stool where it all began. The rusty anchor had been repaired, and Maria had returned to work, though she still kept glancing nervously at the door every time someone new walked in. "Grandpa," I said, "why didn't you ever tell me about your contacts in the SEALS?" Frank took a slow sip of his beer before answering. "Son, there are things about my service that I don't talk about. Things I did, places I went, people I saved. But the Brotherhood never dies. When you bleed with men in combat, when you trust them with your life and they trust you with theirs, that bond lasts forever." He showed me his phone, scrolling through a contact list that read like a who's who of special operations. Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, Air Force Special Operations. Men he'd served with, men he'd trained, men whose lives he'd saved, or who had saved his. "The funny thing about getting old," Frank continued, "is that everyone assumes you're helpless. They see gray hair and wrinkles and think you're just waiting to die. They don't see the warrior you used to be, or the brothers who still have your back." The story of what happened at the Rusty Anchor became legend in the special operations community. Within days, it had spread to military bases around the world, told and retold by men and women who understood the deeper meaning. You never abandon your brothers, no matter how old they get, no matter how long it's been since they wore the uniform. Chief Rodriguez later told me that the SEAL team had been conducting training exercises when my call came in. But even if they'd been on the other side of the world, he said, they would have come. That's what we do. That's who we are. The devil's advocates learned a lesson that many criminals never get the chance to learn. Some people can't be victimized, no matter how old or frail they appear. Some people carry with them the accumulated strength of every battle they've fought and every warrior they've served beside. And sometimes, when you push too hard against someone who looks helpless, you discover that help can come from the sky in the form of helicopters carrying the most elite soldiers in the world. Frank Morrison finished his beer and stood up from his bar stool, moving carefully but with dignity intact. "Come on, Danny," he said. "Let's go home. I've got stories to tell you about real warriors." As we walked toward the door, Maria called out from behind the bar, "See you next Tuesday, Frank." My grandfather smiled and touched the brim of his baseball cap in a small salute. "Wouldn't miss it, Maria. After all, this is my bar." And it was. Not because he owned it, but because he'd bled for the right to drink there in peace. And now everyone knew it. The Brotherhood protects its own. Always.